Good morning, good afternoon or good evening, wherever you might be. When we left part 1 of pivot tables for learners, we were at this stage where we had created the pivot table with the salesperson in the column, the countries in the columns, and the values in the cells themselves. And by default we saw that Excel adds the numbers for me. So the original data was down here. We created the pivot table based on that data, and we, as I mentioned, are at this stage. Now I'd just like to show you the extra things that we can do in pivot tables, and a lot of the items that we will use will be involving the right mouse button. But before we do that, I'd just like to point out to you that if you try to alter a number in a pivot table, let's say we try to alter that number to 3000, it says you cannot change this part of a pivot table report. So how do we update the pivot table? Well, we have to go back to the invoicing, and we make a change here in the pivot table data, and then we go back to the pivot table itself, and in the Analyze tab we look in the data group and we click the refresh button. That will update the pivot table. That is the only way that you can update a pivot table. You cannot update the pivot table itself by changing numbers in cells. Okay, now what we're going to do is, just to make things more easily visible, I'm going to click outside of the pivot table, which will mean that the pivot table field list disappears, as we saw back in part 1. To bring it back, of course, we only needed to click somewhere in the pivot table and the pivot table fields reappear. So let's get rid of it so we can see more of the screen. Now what I'm going to do is just so again that you can see things easily, I'm going to filter the countries, and I just want to see, we'll say the first 4 countries. Maybe we'll say the first 5 countries so we can include Canada. And when I click OK, there I have filtered out all of the other countries except for those 5. And as I see again, the grand totals are there by default, along with the totals along the bottom. So Excel uses the sum function by default. Now I mentioned the right mouse button. The easiest way to analyze data in a pivot table is to right click on a cell. So I'm going to right click on this cell, and up pops a menu. I also see the pivot table fields, and if I want to close that particular field list, then I can click on the Analyze tab at the top, click the drop arrow for show, and just uncheck the field list. So that's another way to get rid of the field list. If you do it that way and you click in the pivot table as I've done, the pivot table field list does not appear, so you'll have to go to the Analyze button, click the show drop arrow and click on field list, and up it pops again. So I'm going to get rid of it because we don't particularly want it to take up space on the screen. Now when I right click on a cell and say format cells, it will only format that cell or other selected cells. So if I change that to a currency with no decimal places and click OK, you'll notice that only that cell has changed. But if I right click on a cell and say number format and choose currency, no decimal places we'll say for appearance sake, and click OK, all of the numbers achieve the $sign in front of them that are in the pivot table. So I'm going to undo that last action and that one, so we're back to where we started. I'm going to right click again, and let's see what else I can do. Incidentally, there is a refresh command in the right click menu. I can sort, but we'll look at that in an upcoming video. Summarize values by. Now this is quite important. To see how this works, I'm going to bring the pivot table field list back, and I'm going to drag another extended price down into the values. Now I'll close the pivot table field list. This time I'll use the cross, and I see that there is a duplicated sum of the extended price. To use this for analysis purposes, what I'm going to do is to right click on one of the cells and then summarize the values, we'll say by count, because that enables me to count the number of sales for analysis purposes as well as seeing the sum of the extended prices. So we'll right click again and we'll say summarize values by. I wonder what the highest sale was that was achieved in that group of cells. There we go, that shows me the highest, the max. What was the lowest sale achieved? That's min. And there are the lowest sales that were achieved in that particular group of cells. Of course I could scroll across to see up to Canada. So there we go. Now, having analysed the data for that type of situation, I can also summarise values by an average. But the average shows me too many decimal places. So what I'm going to do is to click on the Analyze button. My apologies, I'm going to right click on the cell again, and we'll say number format, and we want to see, we'll say the currency, decimal places none. That puts the dollars back, and you'll notice that it has removed the decimal places from the numbers themselves. Let's undo that action. It came from there. It takes it up to the next dollar where it's 0.5 or higher, or down where it's below 0.5. So we'll undo again, and now we want to get rid of that particular column there, having analysed the data. The way I do that is this. I'll bring the field list back, and all I need to do is to drag that off and drop it back into there. So it's nice and easy. No problem at all there. Now let's look at the next thing that I can do in pivot tables for analysis purposes. And I underline again, the reason we use pivot tables is to analyze data. And this time I would like to see some percentages. What percentages are the numbers perhaps of the entire sales for these 5 countries, or the percentage of a particular column, etc. And the way I do that is to right click on a cell, any cell, and this time I say show values as, and you'll notice in here there are lots of percentages available to me. The ones we'll look at are the percentage of grand total, percentage of the column total, and the percentage of the row total. You might like to experiment with others as you need. But let's click on percentage of grand total, and there I see, when I scroll across a little bit, here are the percentages of the sales for each salesperson of the grand totals. I'll close the field list again so we can see. So pivot tables are terrific for analysing data. You'll notice that all of these numbers here add up to 100, and all of those numbers there add up to 100. Let's look at how the columns and the rows are percentaged. Right click, show values as, percentage of the column total, and this time the percentage for each salesperson shows me the percentages in relation to the grand total for the columns. Where there is a 0 there, it means that there were no sales by that person in that particular country. And the rows work in exactly the same way. Summarize value, show values as a percentage of the row total. There we go, the grand total there is for the rows, and it's really quite easy if you use the right mouse button. So that will keep our brain working for a little bit. Don't forget to practice, and certainly don't forget to subscribe unless you've already done so. We love likes and comments. Any questions that you might have, please enter a comment and I'll get right back to you and answer any questions that you might have. Thank you again for watching. Bye for now.